A few years ago, I made a stupid mistake and I broke my right ankle. I had to stay in bed for a while. When I have to move around, I depend on my left leg alone. If you had a similar experience, you know what would happen next. After I stopped using my right leg, all the muscles on it disappeared. And the most amazing part was that it happened in just 1 month. Why am I telling you this? Well, simple. We are life forms and we adapt. When the environment changes, we follow, and we follow quickly. That was what happened to my muscles. The moment those muscles were stopped being used, my body cut off the nutrients to them. They quickly withered. However, after 2 months, I began to do some recovery exercises. All the muscles quickly grew back in just a few weeks. That was how fast our body adapted to the changes of the environment. Surviving on Earth isn't easy for any species. The competition is brutal. Only the best can survive. We are constantly trying to adapt to the changes, and the speed of the reaction is always amazing. I remember when I was in college, one day the gym teacher decided to teach us how to swim in a hot summer afternoon. We went to a public swimming pool and enjoyed 2 hours of childish happiness. It was my first time in the pool, so I stayed inside the pool the whole time. When I finally climbed out of the pool, my body was so heavy that walking became very difficult. Then I realized that I didn't become heavier in any way. It was my body adapted to the reduced gravity in the water in just 2 hours, and my muscles were already relaxed and became weaker. What is a society? A society is just a bunch of people who interact with each other. People adapt. A society also adapts. When the environment changes, a society follows. The truth is, if the environment doesn't change, we don't really have to change at all. But unfortunately, the environment always changes, and we are always adapting, sometimes unnoticeably. This is what happened and still is happening in our world. Dominating the whole world for so long without any challenges, the Western world was relaxed and became weaker. In 2024 presidential election in the U.S., Americans couldn't even find another qualified candidate among 350 million people. That's how weak the entire Western world has already become. On the other hand, China has been living in an environment that was filled up with dangers and challenges. China didn't die. China survived and came out strong. But when Westerners talk about China's rise, they still only focus on ideologies and nothing else. This failure of understanding our basic nature leads to the most consequential misunderstanding of China, the misunderstanding of the Communist Party of China. So let me tell you a story, but I need to make some modifications for the protagonist in the story. According to what I have learned, communism and China are bad words in the Western world. So I'm going to change these 2 words into something neutral. Communist into work, China into ANIC, the Work Party of ANIC, or WPA. I want to tell you the story in a neutral way, and I'm going to make the whole story as abstract as possible to avoid provoking any political and moral judgments. Okay, here we go. In a parallel universe, ANIC is a country on an island that is well known for its breathtaking landscape and majestic mountains. The tallest mountain in the nation inspired the name of ANIC, and that mountain bears the name of a mythical figure who is thought to lived thousands of years ago when the ancestors of Anichim people first arrived on this island. Since then, they have proliferated and dispersed throughout the island. Encircled by the ocean, ANIC has remained well protected for millennia. However, changes are inevitable. One fateful day, ANIC faces an invasion from formidable enemies, putting its very survival at risk. In order to defend their homeland, the Anichim people must unite against this external threat. Yet, this unity does not materialize. Divergent opinions on the appropriate course of action emerge among the populace. Inspired by a new idea, a faction of Anichins bands together to establish a political party known as the WPA. This organization grows rapidly and assembles its own military force. The existing government perceives both the WPA and its new idea as a more significant danger than the invasion itself. Consequently, a civil war erupts, with the government resolved to eliminate WPA once and for all. The WPA army is considerably weaker than their government counterpart. The WPA army consists of only 86,000 soldiers, while the government boasts an impressive force of over 500,000. Additionally, the government army is well-armed and well-supplied, possessing a substantial arsenal of heavy weaponry and 200 aircraft. In comparison, the WPA army is alarmingly ill-equipped, with some soldiers armed only with spears and broadswords instead of rifles. After suffering a colossal defeat, the WPA army is left with no alternative but to retreat. The government sees a great opportunity. Its force is in constant pursuit. The retreat quickly turns into a long journey, driven solely by the need for survival. The intended destination lies in the northern region of Anik, where the government has weaker control. But the WPA army has to navigate a long detour because the direct route is cut off by the government. This detour not only increases the distance, but also introduces various threats along the way. The relentless pursuit by the government force drives the WPA army into uninhabitable areas, including treacherous mountains and murky swamps. In this harsh environment, the soldiers confront a multitude of adversities, diseases, endless combat, sleep deprivation, fatigue, injuries from combat, food shortage, and insufficient medical supplies and weaponry. Throughout the 368 days, the army is predominantly on the move, with many succumbing to battles, illness, and starvation. They traverse 18 mountains, some perpetually shrouded in snow, cross 24 rivers, and engaged in over 300 battles. However, the most formidable threat they confront is the pervasive sense of despair and the erosion of hope. For 368 days, they retreat, witnessing the death of those around them. Some they know, some they don't, while acutely aware that they could be next. How long can a human spirit endure? How much suffering can one bear before breaking? This army goes through a living hell, and yet, against all the odds, they survive after 368 days. This is the alternative and also simplified version of the famous Long March. That was the crucial turning point in the CPC history. Now, answer this question. What must you have to survive such an ordeal? Well, first, you must have a strong physical body. This is the foundation. The second one, you must have enough luck, not being killed by bullets, not eating anything poisonous, etc. The third one, the most important one, you must have a strong faith. The journey was not just for the survival of the people who believed in a new idea, but also for the survival of the idea itself. At the beginning, it was the people who supported the idea, but in the end, it was the idea that supported the people who move on and fight on. The total distance the Red Army traveled is complicated, because not all the Red Army moved together. They separated into several branches and traveled through different paths. The longest one is at least 10,000 kilometers or 60,000 miles. The branch that finished this longest journey suffered the greatest loss. Less than 10% of the soldiers survived. It began with 86,000. Only 7,000 reached their destination. In total, about 30,000 soldiers finished the long march on different paths. These 30,000 soldiers were all hardcore fighters, the real men of steel. They had the strongest bodies. They also had the strongest faith. Talking about the faith, allow me to digress a little bit. People need to be encouraged. Imagine you are a football coach for little children. When they fail to do something, which is a good idea, encouraging them to try again or scolding them for being a loser. You see, we are kind of like balloons. Before the air is pumped in, we are soft, small, and wrinkled. After the air is pumped in, we are hotter, bigger, and impressive. Struggling for thousands of years, we grasp the importance of a strong faith. We know when we are dealing with challenges, especially extreme challenges, we need to give not 100% of ourselves, but 200% or even more. And a strong faith is the only means that could help us achieve that. It gives us the strength to try again and again. However, most people don't possess strong faith. Only a tiny fraction of people do. Most people actually tend to lose their faith quite easily. If the society goes wrong somehow, people would begin to cry, "Oh, we are doomed. This country sucks. The economy is collapsing. Oh God, why bad things always happen to me?" Even if people have a strong faith at the beginning, faith will leak like the air in the balloons. In the end, we depend on people who have stronger faith to reinforce us. That's how leadership works. That's how religion works. That's actually how any organization works. Making people believe that the victory is close is the most important part of leadership. If people stop believing that, they would simply just give up and never try again. And trying again is how we achieve anything, because it increases the chances of success significantly. Now let's continue. It's always the way we handle the challenges that defines us. The Long March redefined those 30,000 soldiers. They were not just a political party anymore after the Long March. They became the source of a strong faith. First for the new CPC members, then for the whole country. The CPC calls it the revolutionary optimism, but the better translation would be the unconditional optimism, which means no matter what happened, you keep your hope alive. Those 30,000 soldiers marched out and expanded. They were still ill-equipped. They were still fighting alone without any help from the outside world, but they spread a new faith to the whole country. And only 13 years after the Long March, the CPC took over the entire China. That was how the environment reshaped a group of people. When the economy reform began in 1980s, the Chinese government called it the New Long March. Indeed, the reform and the Long March had something in common. The reform also was teeming with challenges. Running this giant country in the old way wasn't easy already. Lifting it to meet modern standards is even harder or even impossible. More than 1/3 of the population were completely illiterate in 1980. Most people only had a very low education level. Building this country needed educated people, especially highly educated people. But since the country was poor, the government couldn't even keep them. After graduation, lots of talented people went to the Western countries and never returned. The Western countries didn't even have to spend money on educating them because they had already finished colleges. China, on the other hand, had to spend lots of money on educating those people from kindergartens to elementary schools to high schools, then colleges. The moment those people finally could make contributions to the society, they were gone. China has been losing highly educated people for decades. The country was huge and poor. Over 70% of people lived in villages as farmers. That was over 700 million people, twice the total population in America. They live in over 2 million villages. Most of them were located in very remote places. Some even were isolated by mountains, deserts, or jungles, and most of them were in poverty. It seems that food won't be a problem with all the farmers. Sadly, most of them still use the traditional technologies, Agricultural production was low. Food was still rationed. The industry barely existed. The average monthly salary was less than $10. Things like televisions were still luxury for most people. The list goes on. But the worst part was still coming. The Chinese government began to educate children about 100 years of humiliation since 1980s. The lesson was that China was beaten for 100 years because China was weak. The solution? Making China stronger. The education was a great success. The Chinese government inspired the Chinese people to work together and work hard for a bright future. But at the same time, the education also opened the door for over-criticism. I mentioned in the first chapter that Chinese started a cultural movement since 1980s. All the information from rich countries was overwhelmingly positive. When the new education direction combined with this cultural movement, a strong force was generated. It pushed the Chinese to improve the country, but at the same time, it also caused some nasty effects. For 40 years, Chinese have been constantly comparing China with all the rich countries, so they could learn something to make China stronger. Since all the information from those countries was all positive and China was poor, the comparison was always terrifying. China was inferior at pretty much every aspect. As a result, hatred against China, Chinese people, and the Chinese identity was brewing inside China. It was a time when Chinese were constantly denying themselves, even condemning themselves. I think Chinese people said China sucks more than any other people. Whenever something went wrong in China, some people would inform Chinese how those rich countries handled the situation. Usually it was better. Chinese certainly learned something, but at the same time, they felt a little worse about themselves. Chinese people not only targeted China's current situation, because of the education on the 100 years of humiliation, everything happening in China after the First Opium War was dug out and condemned repetitively because none of them looked good. For over 100 years, China was constantly invaded, defeated, and humiliated. There was nothing but shame in those 100 years. All of these became a mountainous burden the new generation had to carry while they tried to trudge forward. That's why I mentioned previously being a Chinese in these 40 years wasn't easy. It wasn't indeed. From time to time, you will feel terrible being Chinese. In recent few years, the Chinese finally had something to be proud of, but in 1980s, 1990s, and at the beginning of the 21st century, Chinese had pretty much nothing to make them feel good about themselves. Now, looking back at what happened during those 40 years, I have to say, comparing China to all the rich countries was unfair at best, insane at worst. But that was what happened back then. People's spirit was dropping, the desperation was spreading. Most people didn't see the slightest chance that China would catch up with the rich countries. They were constantly on the edge of losing hope completely. Some did lose their hope completely and left China, bringing their hatred to the Western world. The hatred fanned the flames of anti-China sentiment that had been nurtured by the anti-communism propaganda for decades in the Western world. The international environment also became hostile to China. China was slowly isolated from the world, and that further reinforced desperation inside China. The situation was bad, but interestingly, this was exactly when the spirit of the Long March began to shine. Handling desperation was the CPC's strong suit. They knew how to encourage people to move forward. It was what the Long March was all about. So for 40 years, it was always the CPC that has been pushing Chinese people forward without hesitation. It was always the CPC that has been pumping faith, hope, and determination into Chinese people, so they won't falter facing all the challenges. The CPC acquired its power from the Long March, but it was a power that had nothing to do with the foreign idea. It was the power that buried inside all the Chinese people. In the chapter 6, I talk about how Chinese people take everything the sky throws at their faces without complaints. The CPC enhanced it and then transcended it. It was supposed to be a weakness of Chinese people, because it discourages people to fight back. But the CPC transformed it into something new. Don't wish for an easy life. Wish for a strong heart. This became the spirit of the New Long March. And this spirit kept encouraging Chinese people. Don't complain. Just work hard and keep your hope alive no matter what, and you will achieve your dream. Just like what happened in the old Long March, don't complain. Just work forward and keep your hope alive no matter what, and you will reach your destination. And the Chinese people indeed have been moving forward with strong hearts. They kept working really hard for 40 years non-stop. They took it for granted that enduring the hardship was a part of their lives, or eating bitterness in Chinese. Chinese people's weakness was turned into a strength. With this strength, the Chinese government made detailed plans for the country. Every step was only a baby step. The country must move forward slowly and steadily. The Long March wasn't just about moving forward mindlessly like a bunch of zombies. Faith was the boat. Working hard was the paddles. Plans were the rudder. Everything could be planned, must be planned. And the plans must be executed precisely. These were what the CPC learned from the old Long March. They put them into use during the new Long March. The economic reform was literally treated like a battle. The Chinese government encouraged people by controlling the direction of the cultural development. Movies, TV shows, music, literature, and art must promote positivity and optimism. Whining was not allowed. Prostitution, drugs, gamble, and pornography are strictly illegal. Historically, these things were the source of moral degradation and the signs of extreme socio-economic inequality. Constant cracking down on these crimes also was employed as a reminder to all the Chinese people that it wasn't time to enjoy your life yet. Negative information about the society and the government was strongly suppressed. That was how the unconditional optimism worked, because the CPC understood too well during the Long March how easily people would lose their hopes, and the dire consequences when that happened. The CPC believed that what they learned from the Long March would work again, and that they were determined to it. The Western world had been trying to contain the power of any country that had a potential to challenge the Western domination. But China was never the major target because the country was poor and seriously underdeveloped, posing no threat to the Western domination. Plus, all the negative information about China spread by the self-hating Chinese confirmed the Westerners' belief that China was a big mess. But the last nail in the coffin was a lack of freedom of speech. The Western world was very proud of freedom of speech, to the point that freedom of speech, especially the right to criticize the government, was treated as the essence of Western civilization. So even though the CPC made lots of right decisions, lack of freedom of speech overshadowed all of them. Lack of freedom of speech became the only thing all the Westerners could see. They were blinded by their own bigotry. China was nailed permanently on the list of hopeless countries and isolated from the world as a non-believer, a pagan. In consequence, the entire Western world seriously underestimated the CPC and deeply believed that China had no future under its leadership. They didn't really pay much attention to China. Technologies and money flooded into China without a check. The Chinese government made policies to provide the greatest convenience for all the investment. Quickly, China turned into the world factory. For the Western world, if a country was willing to pollute its air and poison its people, that was its own problem. Actually, the Western world was jubilant, moving all the pollution to some dumb country that had no idea what they were doing. More companies moved their factories to China delightedly. Little did all the politicians in the Western world know that engineering has been Chinese people's strong suit for thousands of years consistently. In the modern time, all Chinese people needed was an opportunity to learn from the best, and they did. China was like a giant sponge, absorbing everything as fast as they could. But China didn't blindly learn everything without discrimination. The CPC was well aware of the risk of turning China into a giant factory. The rapid industrialization and urbanization were causing serious pollution in China. It was another tough battle in the new Long March. The CPC didn't want to repeat what happened in the Western world during the Industrial Revolution. When the air pollution in Beijing was heavily criticized by the Westerners, the Chinese government was determined to make changes. There used to be a giant steel factory right next to Beijing, called Capital Steel Factory. It was built in 1919 and became the largest steel mill in China. It was a small city by its own. At the peak, there were 100,000 workers in the factory. If you visited Beijing in the 1990s, you would notice that the map of a Beijing subway looked like this, one arm stretched out to the west very long. That was where the steel factory located. To solve the problem of pollution, the government started a campaign called Give Blue Sky Back to Beijing. One of the actions was relocating the Capital Steel Factory. Started from 2005, it took 5 years to finish the mission. The whole factory was moved to a new location near the ocean. This was how strongly the Chinese government committed to its promises. And this strong commitment is the reason why China didn't turn into a heavily polluted wasteland while producing over 1/3 of products in the world. Visiting China today, you will notice how clean all the cities are. This is how good the CPC is at making and executing plans and strategies, and how fast they adapt to the environmental changes. The legacy of a Long March was rich and powerful. One thing that the Western politicians all fail to see. But I think the worst misunderstanding about the CPC is where it gets its power. Power is not something you create. Power is something other people gave to you. Confucianism survived in China for thousands of years isn't coincidental. Many Westerners observed that China is actually more democratic after they lived in China for a while and understood China a little better. That might surprise the most Westerners because they firmly believe that there is no Western-style voting system in China, hence no democracy. I'm going to talk about the voting system and democracy in another chapter. For this chapter, let's focus on something Mencius said. Mencius said, 得民心者得天下, which means who wins over the people wins the world. This is the fundamental guideline of how the Chinese government works, not just for today, but for thousands of years. It's the only solution for running a giant country. Coercion consumes too much energy. The Chinese government was and will never be powerful enough to force people to submit with or without modern technologies, especially for a long period of time. It's physically impossible for a giant country. The Long March was when the Confucianism began to shine. During the Long March, the CPC army had more chances to contact remote villages. The CPC leaders set strict and also very simple rules for their soldiers. Most soldiers were originally farmers. They were illiterate. That was why the rules were very simple. For example, they had to pay for what they took from the villagers. And they were not allowed to damage the crops. They were not allowed to harass women, etc. These simple rules built a very different army that didn't frighten the civilians. As a result, even though the Long March was the most desperate moment for the CPC still was able to win over lots of poor people. They joined the army and found a new purpose for their lives. Poor people were powerless, but there were many. Their support was the foundation of the CPC's taking over China only 13 years after the Long March. Without this foundation, it was an impossible task for a poorly equipped army. The CPC had another transformation during the Long March. The party was inspired by a foreign idea. Now it went back to Chinese root. The CPC encouraged the poor people to join the party and fight for their own interests. The members have been increasing ever since. Today, the total CPC members are almost 100 million. Majority were middle class and poor people. They are holding the most important positions in the government. The Chinese government is not dominated by rich people like all the Western governments. The CPC is a political party that is deeply rooted in the people and works for the people. Again, don't think about 100% efficiency. For 40 years, the CPC allowed all the positive information from the Western world and created a cultural movement that made the Chinese people super humble. They asked the Chinese people to face the 100 years of humiliation without generating hatred against the culprits of the humiliation, namely pretty much all the Western countries. Instead, the Chinese people were asked to look within to find the problems on themselves. At the same time, the unconditional optimism made sure that Chinese people won't lose themselves after being bombarded by the awe-inspiring glories of the Western world. And it was what happened. After 40 years, Chinese people didn't lose themselves. China didn't turn into another puppet regime of the Western world. Instead, Chinese people are now ready to challenge the entire Western world with great confidence. It wasn't easy to rise in the environment when the Western world is hostile to anyone who is challenging its domination. But under the leadership of the CPC, Chinese people stand strong in front of all the superpowers, and they are in the vanguard of an alternative path to success. Like I mentioned in the Chapter 3 of the One-Child Policy, everything in China is complicated beyond our imagination. But for decades, the Westerners and the Chinese people themselves took it for granted that everything could only be judged by the Western standards. It's already a religion. That's the reason the Westerners underestimated China and are still confused about China's rise. Some people probably are still foolishly waiting for China's collapse. So let me save you some time. Like the second coming of Jesus, it's not going to happen in your lifetime. Without a better understanding about our society and ourselves, we will be confused about everything forever. So for all the Westerners, China's rise is a great opportunity to fine-tune all your conclusions about China, especially about the CPC, but more importantly, about yourself.